What we are doing is not only cutting people's contributions under national insurance, but also helping businesses to invest with the 130% super deduction that my right honourable friend put in. And what that is doing is helping us to have a high-wage, high-skill economy with unemployment, and that's why I said this before, Mr. Speaker, at the lowest since 1974.
Well, he said there that they're cutting national insurance, but they're not. They've increased it. And, of course, what they're doing is they're shifting taxation from the wealthy to the poor. So things like national insurance are much less progressive than income tax.
And what about these things like these congestion charges and the so-called clean air charges when we've got air quality improving in Bristol and London, yet the government is slowly but surely adding these extra costs to poorer people. And if you're wealthy enough to afford a brand new Range Rover or BMW Chelsea tractor, you don't pay a penny.
Well, the overall burden of tax has shifted dramatically in my lifetime. The actual level of tax hasn't changed that much. It's just shifted from wealthy people to poor people. And, of course, that's ultimately self-defeating because there are more poor people than wealthy people, and they ultimately, their consumer spending is what ought to be driving the economy. But, of course, they're going to soar off the branch they're sitting on. They'll probably be forced to carry on spending and printing money because they haven't really got any other options because they're not going to raise taxes on their own. That's definitely not going to happen. So we're careering into an inflation crisis, which is actually a deflation crisis because wages are falling, and then there will be a property market collapse. And then, of course, relatively comfortable people will wake up to the mess that this Conservative government has created.
OK, so let's go to have a listen to Kevin Cahill now, former Sunday Times Rich List journalist. Actually, let's let him introduce himself to give us his take on this year's Sunday Times Rich List.
My name is Kevin Cahill, and I'm a journalist. And a long time ago, I worked at the Sunday Times on the Rich List. I was eventually the deputy editor.
Can you give us an idea of what the task was like in uncovering people's hidden wealth when you were at the Sunday Times?
Well, start with the Queen. It was very difficult. For the first 5 or 6 years, the Queen topped the list. And she topped the list because we said, probably me in particular, that she owned the Crown Estate. Well, the first thing the coalition government did in 2010 was grant her the ownership of the Crown Estate. But the palace phoned Murdoch and told him that having the Queen at the top of the list was discrediting the list, that we were mixing up her non-personal assets with her personal assets. And then the Tory Lib Dem coalition government fixed that. She became the legal owner of the Crown Estate. So that was the first one we had a problem with. Murdoch intervened, persuaded the editor that it would be better to reduce the Queen's holdings to a nominal. They're about 290 million, but that's a fraction of, if the Crown Estate is worth 10 billion, she would still be up in the top 10.
So what is a non-personal asset? Surely it's an asset which the Queen, even whether or not she actually owns it in a personal capacity, she still controls it.
Well, that applies to the palaces and everything. But we would have always accepted that there are things like Buckingham Palace that are, in theory, at any rate, it's never clear. There's nothing in writing, but that they really belong to the state and the people. Although you wouldn't believe that if you tried to get into Buckingham.
Well, that's because the state pays for its upkeep, and large amounts of money going to pay for its upkeep, even though it's her house.
Yeah, no, that's, she's the head of state, and the head of state typically has a decent pad. And we would not, but the Crown Estate was different. I always felt, and I read all the documents and the history, I always felt that was hers, and then the government made it hers, so that solved the problem, except she never went back to her proper position in the Sunday Times Rich List.
So you think she should be number one still?
No, she wouldn't make number one. She'd be around about 10. Yeah, she'd be she'd be about number 10 or 11.
So is there any distinguishing between her and, say, Prince Charles? He's also very personally wealthy with the Duchy of Cornwall.
He's the personal owner of the Duchy of Cornwall, which has property all over the place. And he would be a billionaire. He'd be worth about $1 billion based on the assets in the duchy. And they talk about him being the trustee. But if you're a permanent trustee, i.e., you know, if it passes from you to your son and so on, you own it. And he has he can't dispose of the duchy as such. There is a restraint in the Duchy of Cornwall Act, but there's nothing, after that, he runs it, his council and his advisors.
So what about the latest rich list? How accurate do you think that is in describing the actual wealth, including the hidden wealth?
Take one example, the Duke of Westminster, the 7th Duke, the current one, was Grosvenor. As long ago as 30 years ago, Richard Norton Taylor at The Guardian established that all the Westminster assets are held in offshore trusts. What Richard wasn't able to find was where they were. I think they're in Canada, but they could be anywhere. But he's in at about 11 billion, and double that. So there's never been a denial that the assets are held in trusts. Where the trusts are has never been revealed.
So the Duke of Westminster is not only a large landowner of country land, woodland, farmland, that sort of thing, but he's also a massive owner, isn't he, in the posh parts of London, like Mayfair? 300
acres, the freeholds of, mostly. I mean, that nowadays, well, that would give him a value of 5 billion, perhaps 10. Hard to pin it down because the freeholds are quite widely. I did some work on trying to establish which of the freeholds were the Grosvenor estate, but I had the same problem Richard Norton Taylor had. I couldn't establish where the trusts were. Now, for tax purposes, not the present Duke, but the last one, did say he was the beneficiary. He actually made a declaration that he was the beneficiary of the trusts, but he didn't say where the trusts were.
Okay, do you want to just take a look at this weekend's rich list then, and pick up some names from there?
Well, what I'd want to pick up is there are several people on the rich list who are sanctioned because of their contacts with Putin. First of all, I personally wouldn't object to people who want to live in Britain, so long as they pay their taxes. That should be the thing. But here, you can have a, £300 million pad in Bishop's Avenue in London, and you pay 30 grand, and you don't pay any taxes on your other assets. And in some cases, there are people with, where's this list gone? Extremely significant assets. Alisher Usmanov, some of them have assets that are connected, according to the government, to Putin. So they're living, one of them, I can't remember which it was, tried to pay his dentist and found his credit card was stopped, and he's in the rich list at 10 billion. So there are people on the rich list who are sanctioned by the British government now. Mikhail Friedman, Moshe Kantor, and others, most of whom acquired, but there's something very important, and I hadn't seen the book. I don't know how I missed it. There's a book called Kleptopia by Tom Burgess, a Financial Times writer. And if you want to know the true extent of corruption in the higher levels of society, especially the wealthy, that I'm surprised Tom Burgess is still alive. He named the names, he named the guilty, and he connected them to the wealth. Of course, you probably know that some London law company tried one of these slap cases against Tom, one of the crooks put in a truthful statement that he thought Tom had got privileged information about a company he used to own. Well, Tom did. And what the privileged information showed was that Putin and his people owned 1/3 of all the assets behind the scenes. That these Russian billionaires were actually front men for the Putin crowd.
Well, yeah, but they might well argue, Kevin, that they are trying to sort of keep one foot on both sides of the fences in the dispute between East and West over the last few decades, in that they want to have assets in London as well as in Russia. They're not necessarily loyalists one way or the other. They're surely waiting to see the way things develop as to which way to jump.
One or two of them have actually criticised the war, but I don't think that's I think the real issue, and it's in Burgess's book, and it's really spelt out in a way I had never seen it before. He picks the crooks who stole the assets, but who were especially the ones who were close to Putin, and most of them got the assets by effectively it was theft. You know, state assets came on the market and it was rigged, and certain people got the bulk of the assets.
We're talking here about the oligarchs in the 1990s, yeah?
Well, the problem with the oligarchs is everybody in the UK, and I would include Tom in this, is ferocious and amazing. There's no... Tom's book is... I've never seen a book like it. But they've forgotten the other oligarchs, including Rupert Murdoch. There's two sets of oligarchs, and you know what? Well, who was it? Said it. Oh, behind every great fortune lies a great crime, and the focus right now is, of course, on the Russian oligarchs, as nasty a bunch as you would ever hope to meet in a day's walk. But on the other side are the oligarchs, if you like, that in my old stories, the ones who are currently imposing criminal and unlawful mass surveillance in the United Kingdom and getting away with it.
Well, this is what bothers me, is if you're a multi-billionaire and you have your assets squirreled away in the Cayman Islands or somewhere, you effectively you could be one of the wealthiest people in the country and be paying less tax than somebody that's on medium sort of low wages.
Yep. A doctor, perhaps, would pay more tax than a great number of the people on the rich list who have houses here and small palaces and what have you. They pay 30 grand and that's it. And their assets, this is the other part of the scandal. Back in the 1930s, or even earlier after World War I, the very rich and the aristocratic in the United Kingdom and the palace set, it's important to say that, developed this concept of offshore ownership. It started with Canada, but then suddenly they discovered all these little islands, Jersey, Isle of Man, Guernsey, and so on. And the palace crowd, especially the aristocrats with assets, put the ownership of the assets, you know, in Bermuda, the Virgin Islands, Grand Cayman, whatever you have. And none of those, and they all belong in it, they're all governed by Britain or ruled by Britain. They're British colonies. And anybody with money can hide anything they like in the British offshore islands. It's a disgrace. It's a disgrace because a lot of them, some people make money reasonably, but an enormous amount of the money in the British offshore islands was stolen, especially in Africa and then Russia.
We had a clip from an interview Ben Norton has done for his Multipolar World podcast with an economist called Michael Hudson last week, and he's talking about this whole idea of the financialization of the economy, which means everything being turned into financial assets and basically untaxed, so that those savings that people are getting, hoarding basically, provides them with a very good income. But they're not actually producing anything from it. It's just the financial services industry slowly but surely swallowing up the rest of the economy, and of course making it impossible for industry to thrive, because they are charging enormous amounts of money for basic things like housing, water. Most importantly, recently we've seen energy, gas, petrol, diesel, and that these sorts of economies, Michael Hudson argues, Kevin, are basically down a cul-de-sac. They're going to hit a brick wall very soon because they can't compete internationally.
I'm dead on. I think he's got his finger there. And again, that's what Tom Burgess's book shows, that places like the Congo and places like Zimbabwe had all their assets financialized and moved out of the country. So no benefits go to, the ordinary person in the Congo. They all go to the people who own the assets in places like Bermuda, the Bahamas, Cayman Islands, and so on. The benefit of the ownership goes to these crooks. A lot of them are out.
A rentier economy, this is the French word, because you're basically just playing golf whilst your rent income from your property or from your assets provides you with an income, and everyone else is struggling to work for you. But I did an article recently for Leveller's Day, actually, looking at the Labour Party's campaigns around the 2019 election, and there were press reports saying that the what they call lifetime gifts tax, that it was in a George Monbiot report which the Labour Party took up, called Land for the Many, that there could be 10 million people brought into, or even somewhere between 5 and 10 million, brought into having to pay some kind of inheritance tax on their home. That is to say, if the children didn't have assets or cash of around something like 10, 20, 30,000 pounds to pay, they would have to sell the house. So the house would not be passed on. It would go out onto the open market, maybe be snapped up by a bank or whatever. Now, in the modern world, surely we've done quite a good job, haven't we, Kevin, in buying, since the Second World War, houses. It seems that the Labour Party is keen on the idea that inheritance tax shouldn't apply to just to massive estates like the old feudal estates, that it should be ordinary people, anyone with a home over about £300,000, which I'm afraid is lots and lots of places nowadays, particularly in London. And even if you look at London, this is social cleansing. So if you've got a house which has gone up in value because of the housing bubble to astronomical amounts, as many in London have, you won't be able to pass it on to your children, and the kids will have to move out of London. So I just wonder what you make of this Labour policy, if you've come across this before, or back in 2015.
I've come across it twice. The Tories promised to deal with it by raising the level to £1 million. This was supposed to reflect the change in the value of houses and to more easily reflect the value of ordinary homes, and they never did it. It's still likely to have exactly the effect you've just described. Ordinary people, especially in London, with a terraced house, will find themselves, the children will have to sell the house to pay the tax.
What are they doing there structurally? Because this is quite important. If we're working our lives for a house, then we can't pass it on to our kids.
I don't think either parties have grasped it. What's lacking in both of them are numbers. To work out what to do and where to set the level so that most people don't pay tax and can pass their houses on, you need proper figures, and those are missing. Do you remember way back, I used to count the number of houses and how many, people had and where they were and all this sort of thing. Neither party have done this, and they've got to go back and get figures and say, no, the majority of people now own houses that are homes that are worth 1.2 billion or 1.2 million, and you must shift the level up to 1.5 million before the heirs pay tax.
I mean, it seems that both parties quite like the idea that people won't own their own homes, but will be in the future
renting. No, they will. The whole.
And this also goes along, doesn't it, with Klaus Schwab, Prince Charles, and their World Economic Forum idea of you will own nothing but be happy.
Something like that. Well, do you remember? This was, I could see it at the time, and not many people seemed able to see it. I think you did. Maggie Thatcher was trying to drive everybody into renting. Her real idea was to convert the whole economy into a rentier economy. And she did it in one sense. Everybody jumped up and down when she sold council houses, but she didn't allow the councils to replace the council houses, meaning she was driving people into either very expensive mortgages, which people overlooked, or into renting. And the number of people renting now in the United Kingdom is very high compared with what it was 40 years ago. It's a rentier, you put your finger right on it, it's a rentier economy. And the people benefiting from the rentier economy are mostly the people in the rich list who have got their assets in the Bahamas, Cayman Islands, whatever.
Okay, back to the rich list again, Kevin. Do you think that there are any indications as to who is now at the top of those lists? So, maybe they're oligarchs. Do you think there may be, or who is it that's owning most of the wealth now? Because we do seem to have a system which is set up to funnel wealth from the poorer to the richer. It's actually controlled and owned, it seems, by the super rich to make sure that what they do is just acquire more and more wealth.
And the person who defined what this was all about was George Soros. Do you remember George Soros? The guy who bankrupted Britain during the John Major's government. George is one of the great, I don't know what you call him, but Soros is a billionaire many times over, and he did it by currency gambling, especially against the pound. But Soros, he described this form of capitalism as bandit capitalism. That's what he called it. And he said, so long as you make it legal for me to play the game, I will. That was why he told the UK not to leave to join the euro. He said, so long as you're a small offshore currency, I'll continue to speculate against you and I'll make money. Soros was brutal in his honesty about what was going on, but he said, so long as it's legal, I'll do it. And that's one of the problems, is the present Tory government have made it incredibly easy for this to happen. For the wealth to go up to those with their assets offshore and all the rest of it, and still live here and have a very comfortable British life and spend their money here, which is excellent. But the balance is all wrong. And the drive in the Tory-driven economy is towards making people rent, because that's where these people, the people on the rich list, get all their money.
Yeah, it's almost like a kind of feudal society that they seem to be. Can you just tell us what you think about the cost of living crisis, how that's impacting? I mean, this is not only we've got mortgages going up too now, and also, of course, astronomical profits from the oil and gas industry.
Well, again, there's nothing conventionally. They have made excess and unfair profits. And, of course, an enormous number of people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, are now going to food banks and haven't got the money to pay for heating and food and so on. And one of the major beneficiaries are the oil, gas, and the oil giants, and they are ripe for having the excess profit. During the war, we did the same. The level of profit you could make was limited, and after that, the government took the lot. in this case, a tax on the excess profit is more than reasonable.
Well, what about public ownership, have some of saying?
Again, you wind up, as you would know more than most, you wind up with a bureaucracy. And if you're not prepared to address the issue of bureaucracy, public ownership is a nonsense. One of the things these people do, the people with all this immense wealth, is they take advantage of bureaucracy. The government fiddles a little clause at the back of a bill, which changes everything, and nobody notices it. And the media in particular are absolutely diabolical at watching the small shifts that have big effects, that aid the bureaucracy, and then, in the end, aid these people to have bandit capitalism operating.
Is there any simple way, to fix this massive funneling of wealth from the middle classes and the poor to the rich, Kevin?
There is. You end all offshore tax concessions. You say, you live in Jersey or you have your assets in Jersey, fine. They'll be treated as if they're here in the UK. But certainly the current government, if you read Tom Burgess's book, is absolutely saturated with money from those classed as real criminals. Let's say there's a middle ground of people who may have made money because they were clever entrepreneurs, Russians. But there was a kleptocracy operating in Russia when the Soviet Union collapsed, and they are the current oligarchs. And the way to stop all this is to make the offshore islands, any offshore islands, domestic jurisdictions of the United Kingdom. Then you can reverse it.
I mean, I may be wrong, but it sounds to me as if the major problem that's caused all this is Margaret Thatcher's scrapping exchange controls. The idea that you can move money around the world really only started in, put it wherever you want, in 1980 when Thatcher took power. Yep.
Now, she knew what she was doing, and there has been no effective change at all in the offshore fiddle. The offshore islands are exactly now as effectively, let's go be right about the words, Guernsey, Jersey, the Isle of Man, the Caymans and everywhere else are where the bandits hide their money. And we let them, and we make it legal to do it. And we have more, the United Kingdom is in a much better position to crunch on these people than anyone else.
Okay, Kevin Cahill, thanks very much for joining us.
Okay, Tony, bye.
I thought a terrific insight from Kevin there into this whole sort of wealth divide, which isn't really well analysed at all by the mainstream press, Martin, for obvious reasons, is that they control the press.
Indeed.
Own it.
Yeah.
And in fact, all these major press institutions have got their money offshore too.
That's right. And of course, if everybody's doing it, everybody feels that they're entitled to do it. And it becomes, well, we can't do anything about it because, I've seen Andrew Neil saying, we can't raise taxes on the wealthy because they'll just run away with the money.
Well, I think to be fair, he is a journalist and he'll be putting that argument,
Yes, I know, but
not necessarily something he agrees with.
It then leads to a council of, there's nothing we can do about it, which simply isn't the case. I would argue that if you are a British citizen, it doesn't matter where you live. You can live anywhere. But your assets should all be taxed as a British citizen. And if you don't want that and you want to leave the country, then you go, but you lose your citizenship.
Well, I find so
and your children lose their citizenship.
Fascinating about this is that it's almost similar to what Anne Applebaum was saying earlier on, that a lot of the problem is this massive movement of financial assets around the world, that people are using it strategically and politically.
Yes, I mean, of course, what's actually happening, as I said earlier when we were commenting on what she'd said, is this attack on money laundering and tax evasion in different jurisdictions. There's also an element of make-believe and smoke and mirrors, because by attacking, for example, British tax evasion in the Cayman Islands and the Virgin Islands. What's actually going on behind the scenes is people like Biden, who's based in Delaware, that has become a very good place to hide money. And so therefore there's actually a politics of attacking tax havens, where some tax havens get attacked, so that actually makes other tax havens more.
Money just shifts about, doesn't it? It's whack-a-mole, basically. What about what Kevin's saying there, and I was saying about the idea of trying to tax people when the parents die or when they die, so they can't hand on their homes? I mean, this adversely affects. I mean, they're saying, even the Conservatives are saying, we're going to make it so that only estates over $1 million are taxed. But actually, there's loads of terraced houses in London over $1 million. And this is a form of social cleansing. The idea is that if you're living in London, then you better move out, otherwise you're going to lose your home when you die.
Well, I mean, if you're not going to get the tax off the super wealthy, then you've got to get it from somebody else.
Well, get it off the super wealthy. Why get it off the middle classes?
Well, because the middle
or the poor.
That's because the super wealthy.
You'd rather tax the middle classes than the super wealthy.
No,
and you think that's okay?
I didn't say that. I just said exactly the opposite, Tony. If you don't tax the super wealthy, then you've got to find the money from somewhere else, and that means the other poor schmucks have to pay it. Because ultimately, if you're going to go to war in the Ukraine and solve climate change and rebuild the infrastructure, it's got to be paid for somehow. You can either print the money or you've got to get it through taxes. And if you're not going to tax the wealthy, it means the ordinary punters have to come up with the money, doesn't it?
Print the money sounds a better idea. Anyway,
well, yes, because what you can do with printing the money, and that's what used to happen in the 60s and 70s, is you get a moderate level of inflation going, and that basically the asset owners are constantly losing value, and that's one of the reasons why the Thatcher and Reagan revolution took place, because they've made their little nest eggs inviolable.
Well, the opposite's happened now, is everyone's putting their money into housing, and as we were saying earlier, shops and things like that, property, and then just boarding it up because it's like money in the bank.
Well, that's right. It's a misallocation of resources, which is not efficient.
Anyway, our penultimate item this week, we'll leave that and a bit more about all that stuff next week.